Welcome to Prepping for the Studio. If you're a musician or musical artist that wants to learn more about what goes on, how to prepare, or how to make the most out of your studio session, you're in the right place. Prepping for the Studio. Episode 1. Roy and Brian introduce themselves and the podcast and give you the 50,000-foot view of the record-making process. Thanks for joining. Hello. Welcome to Prepping for the Studio. First episode of this podcast. This is the first podcast that I've ever done. My name is Roy Silverstein. I'm joined by my incredible co-host, Brian Scheuble.
Hello.
Hi, Brian. And yes, you've come across another podcast, but this one, if you're into recording, is going to be a little bit different because this is actually a podcast for musicians. Not really for engineers, although perhaps engineers will find something of value in it. But Prepping for the Studio is really about musicians who are new to the studio and want to learn what goes on in the studio, how to prepare, how to not waste your money, not waste your time, and just feel confident when you come in to record something. And there could be a lot of you out there. We're going to find out. But my name is Roy Silverstein, as I mentioned already, and I've been doing this for recording 25 plus years or so. Brian's actually been doing it longer. How long have you been doing this?
I started around 81.
Okay, we can do the math in our heads, maybe not. Yeah, I got into recording as a teenager. I grew up in the Chicago area. You actually grew up in Illinois also,
Peoria,
right?
yeah. Peoria, Illinois.
Wow, that's funny. We both ended up in San Diego eventually.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got into recording as a teenager, just playing in bands with my friends in the basement because we have basements in Chicago. And I wanted to figure out how to record ourselves because we literally had nothing but a little dictaphone thing that my stepdad used. He was a psychiatrist. It sounded terrible. So luckily the drummer's dad was a musician, actually quite a good musician named Howard Levy. You may know he's an incredible harmonica player. So he had a 4-track that he wasn't using, and he let me use it, and I just kind of taught myself how to use it and got obsessed with it. And I was off for the races, but I ended up studying electrical engineering at University of Miami. There's a program there they call audio engineering, and there's been some well-known engineers that have come out of that program or the sister program that was called music engineering. See, my program was in the College of Engineering, and it was electrical engineering with a emphasis in audio. And then the music engineering was in the School of Music. And that was like, you had to be a musician. Like, I am a musician, but you had to have an instrument and you had to do all the recitals and all that stuff because it was in the School of Music. And I didn't do that because I was an okay musician, but not like, I hated doing all the recitals and all that stuff.
Oh man, I don't blame you.
Yeah. So I went to the College of Engineering one, but the music engineering one had guys like Andrew Sheps pass through that program, Joe Barisi, some pretty well-known engineers actually. But anyways, I did that program, came out to San Diego to work at Qualcomm, which is like a big company that does cell phone chips. And this was 2001 when I came out to San Diego. And I was, basically working on audio-related cell phone stuff, but then on the side, recording and mixing and all that, and just kept doing that until 2010 when I bought a property and decided I was going to build like a proper studio. And that's where we are now. We're at Rarefied Recording, which is my studio. And so, yeah, I did this build out of this studio with this real studio designer and everything. And then took 3 years to do. But after that, took, a couple years of kind of doing the Qualcomm thing and the studio thing. And then the studio thing kind of was taking off. And 2015, I made a little switch and just went full time on the studio, which awesome. Was nerve wracking. But here I still am going strong with the engineering and the mixing and all that. And I wrote this ebook, which is kind of the genesis of this podcast. So if you go to preppingforthestudio.com, you can find the ebook to download, and it's the musician's guide to the recording studio. Basically exactly what we're going to be talking about here, but see, the ebook's kind of long. The ebook is like 65 pages and goes on, and probably a lot of you aren't going to really want to read it. So that's sort of the reason for the podcast, is we're going to break it down into sections and little chunks and nuggets that you can digest in an hour or so.
There's good details in the book.
Yes. Now, Brian, you got to tell us a little bit about yourself, because you've been doing this a lot longer than I, and you kind of provide some extra clout to this whole thing.
Well, didn't you have a house before this, though, that you were doing recording?
Well, yeah, I was renting a house in San Diego, and I called it the Habitat.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And that was like, had a setup there for recording, and I recorded some bands and my own projects, and had house shows.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, like kind of twice a month.
Would you record the show?
At first, I did record the shows. Yeah. I was recording the shows, but then after a while, I was like, okay, this is a lot of work. I don't think I have time to set up these shows, do the live sound, and record the shows, and then do the post-production to like make it, something listenable. So I kind of gave up the recording of the shows part after a few. But I did record a lot of, records there. And that was a good seminal time for me, part of my learning how to be an engineer.
Yeah.
Although some of that started even when I was a teenager with
Yeah.
a 4-track. But yeah, then I bought this house in North Park, in a part of San Diego, and built this whole studio, and been doing rarefied recording since 2015. And I met you because you had moved down to San Diego, and you were looking for a place, and you said I knew there has to be a place that's better than these other options I'm finding. And but tell us about yourself. Where did you start?
Yeah, I moved down to North Park down here in San Diego, and I just was saying to myself, because in LA everybody's got a studio, and every block, there's probably 2 or 3 studios.
And you had been in LA for years, right?
Yeah, well, I went to LA in '79 as a kid, just wanting to get out of Peoria, Illinois.
And as of note, I was born in '79.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
So you had just gotten to LA, and I was just becoming a person.
Not knowing what I wanted to do at all. And then I discovered studios after I was laid off a couple times at the job I had, so I could go to school during the day, but wasn't really applying myself to school. And I got a job at Cherokee Studio, where I started at the ground. We're running for burgers, and eventually that turned into being an assistant engineer in their studios, and then becoming an engineer, and just coming up through that process, which is very different than going to a school. Well, maybe not very different, but I had to learn everything kind of hands-on. And
Had you messed around with audio before?
Well, when I was a kid, it's funny, I would tinker with tape recorders, and I would record stuff off the radio. I remember there was a radio show when I was really little about the Beatles, and it was 4 days straight, and I had a reel-to-reel recorder, and I remember recording that, and I play it back, and I put it through different, I was just tinkering. I had no idea what I was doing, but
Gotcha.
I just loved the electronics. I'd take things apart and look at the stuff, and never really knew what I was doing, but it was really intriguing to me. So it kind of made sense once I saw a control room at a studio. I was like, that's it.
You knew that was where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. Plus, I love music. Music was always around, and I was taking guitar lessons. And in college, I had no clue what I wanted to do, so I took classical guitar for a while, and tennis. Those were the 2 things that I...
And now you play pickleball.
And now I play pickleball. Yeah. Still play tennis.
Oh, good.
But, so I've been doing it for a long time, and I worked on some really big records, and I worked at 2 different studios. Cherokee, I was there for 6 years, working with some incredible producers like Mike Chapman and Roy Thomas Baker, and guys that are really, in their day were making incredible records and sounding records. And during that time, it was all on tape, so things were progressing technically as well. Digital wasn't really a big thing other than, like a DDL, Eventide DDL was the big deal we had, or the 910 harmonizer.
Yeah, early days of what was possible there with digital
Yeah.
processors, I guess.
Yeah.
Before Pro Tools or anything.
Yeah. So it was all pretty much analog.
And what were some of the artists that you got to work with?
In the early days, there were so many. I mean, that first record I ever got a credit on was a punk band in LA called X.
Oh, yeah.
And that was
They're still
exciting.
around.
And that was with Ray Manzarek was the producer from The Doors.
Oh, cool.
So, I was thrown in. I had no idea what I was doing. I was doing switches on mixes and not knowing what a chorus was. I mean, I was really green.
Yeah.
And I worked with a lot of producers, and some good bands, Tina Turner and
Okay.
Rod Stewart and White Snake. And this one studio was kind of your rock studio. Motley Crue was there. And,
Wow.
and Devo. And then after working there for 6 years, I went to a studio called A&M, which was a whole nother level. That was where Jimmy Iovine and Shelley Ackes came in and built studios. And
Wow.
they took over the rooms. Herb Alpert, who was the owner, wanted to really bring the studio up, but he also wanted to bring the studio up where it was for artists. It wasn't for...
He was an artist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he wanted to keep it family-like and friendly, and it was. And so I got brought over there by Shelley. He was working on Tom Petty at Cherokee, and heard about me. I was like this head of the engineering staff. I was kind of like...
Oh, you worked your way up.
I worked my way up, yeah. And then the owners made me kind of like, I would interview guys for when we needed a new engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked with Mike Chapman, who was like the big guy there because he was doing pretty big records at the time, and I was his guy for 4 years.
Okay.
And so then I went to A&M, and that was like a whole nother tier. Then you're working with like, the Stings and the U2s and the Eagles and all these really prestigious bands that are pretty classical. But
Yeah.
and I learned a lot. I had no idea I knew an SSL, but I had no idea how to run one because we had Trident A ranges at Cherokee, and that's all I knew. And Otari tape machines. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have an MCI tape machine, but yeah.
Yeah, originally that's what we had first.
MCIs?
And then they replaced them with the Otaris.
Mm-hmm.
Ampex 2-tracks. And then when I went to A&M, I was excited because I knew I'd learn an SSL and Neves. So they had the Neve, Montserrat Neve, which if you see the Police demo or video where they're dancing on a console, that's the one.
Oh my God. Don't do that.
Yeah. It was cool because I met George Martin and
Wow.
Rupert all at the same
Neve.
time. He signed the console. I think I told you that he signed the console. They both signed it.
Wow.
And there was a runner that came through one night. He was trying to clean. He thought something.
Oh no. Oh jeez.
So yeah, so I did that, and then I went freelance after a while. When you're working at a place, and the good thing about A&M is they really tried to groom you to go out.
Okay.
Because that was the whole idea. They, you could stay there forever, but they really wanted to groom you so that you would go out and get clients and bring those clients back to the studio.
Yes.
Just kind of keep this going, and that's pretty much what happened with a lot of the guys. But sometimes your budgets wouldn't be able to afford those rooms because they were not cheap. But they would give us deals too. So you would go to other studios around town, and then eventually you're just out on your own doing your own thing, which is really the best. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, more freedom.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Who did you work with as a freelancer?
Zach Brown band, Stevie Nicks, Sheryl Crow, Stone Temple Pilots. A lot of bands. I actually had this open so I could remember. But that's a good enough list.
That's enough. See, Brian brings, like I said, some clout to this because who am I? I do own a studio, but I have not worked with such prestigious groups as these. But the point is, you can have some faith that we know what we're talking about here, about this recording and what goes on in the studio and how to prepare, which is kind of what this is all about, bringing it back, to the audience that we're targeting. If you're wondering if this is the podcast for me, if you are a musician, if you are a songwriter, singer-songwriter, if you're a member of a band, anyone who maybe is going to be going to a studio soon, if that's kind of on your agenda that and you haven't done it before, or maybe you've done it but only a little bit and you're kind of uncertain still about some certain aspects of what goes on in the studio and how to prepare and how to, not waste your money and waste your time. That's who we're really speaking to. So engineers, that bit of talk that you had at the beginning there about, tape machines and consoles, that's probably the most we're going to talk about any thing technical like that this whole time, probably, because it's not really going to be about that. And engineers and mixers out there who, are looking for podcasts where they're going to learn tips and tricks, this probably isn't the podcast for you. There's plenty of those, and there's plenty of YouTube channels and all that. However, you still may find some things in here because there's things you could pass on to your clients. You could certainly refer them to preppingforthestudio.com and the ebook that I wrote, because I think it will help you have a smoother session if your clients are more prepared.
Totally.
For the studio, because I think we both experienced, Brian, what can happen when clients come in and they really were not prepared at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the session just kind of grinds to a halt and everyone starts getting a little upset, and
yeah,
it's not really much fun.
And you're paying money while all this is going down.
Yeah, the client, whoever they are, and usually things are self-funded these days, at least with clients I'm working with. So, it's just every second is another dollar or whatever. So that might be an exaggeration in my case, but but it's money, and there's only so much that you can spend on your recording. But yes, thank you for the background there. It's very impressive who you've worked with.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know how it happened. I just was so much into this stuff that you just keep going. Good
time that you landed in LA and you pursued it, and obviously you have capability, natural talent, and you just made a whole career of it, and you're still going. You're still mixing, and mostly mixing these days.
Mostly mixing, but I still record when asked.
Yeah.
I go up to LA sometimes to do that, but
here even.
The funny thing is that, as you were saying, I mean, even on big records where they're spending lots of money and then somebody else is paying for it, so much time is wasted. And I remember seeing big records come in with big budgets, and you're like, man, they could have made this for $10,000. They didn't need to spend, $250,000. And that's just recording costs.
Yeah.
That's not video. That's not all the other things.
Mixing and mastering.
Yeah. So.
Yes. So
it's a good thing.
Everyone could have used this book.
That's right.
Back in the day. I don't know. I didn't really see if there was other books out there like this that I wrote, or podcasts like this. I don't think there's a whole bunch. I think there's a lot for engineers and mixers who want to learn more about the craft. But I don't think there's a lot geared towards musicians who want to learn what goes on in the studio and how to prepare themselves. So I think this is filling a little bit of a hole.
Yeah.
I hope it is, at least.
I think so.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of a good segue to, what we, in this first episode, we want to kind of cover just what is the big picture of the recording process. And then in the next episodes, which I'm not even sure how many there will be, but we're going to, kind of dive into each of those and try to keep it to, an hour or less per episode. But this time we're just going to go over kind of the big picture. So really, it starts before you even step in the studio. There's a whole process that you should be thinking about, if you're not already, of your songwriting and what we call pre-production. So, I mean, yeah, because what I've learned from people like you and reading about other engineers, and it's all about the song, as far as the success of your record, the success of your career, the song is the number one thing.
Yeah.
You can have a amazing song and it could be recorded kind of just all right, and it could still do super well. But you could have okay, not so great song, record it to the nth degree. It's like the best studio in the world, best engineer, blah, blah, blah. If the song sucks, though, nobody's really going to care.
That's so true.
It might sound amazing, but yeah, the song, and you can think about it, like all these older recordings, them going on since the 50s or whatever. I mean, some of them do sound amazing, but a lot of them, like, technically, like, if when you compare them to a modern recording, like, they lack, you know, low end. There's like weird distortions and
distortion.
Yeah, all kinds of weird things going on sonically that are cool, but you know, I don't know if they were really intentional. I think they were just more of an artifact of this was the technology of recording they had at the time, you know.
I think a lot of times too, sometimes they would only do a couple takes and they would go out and the whole band's playing together, so you had to kind of get it together quickly.
Yeah.
And maybe an engineer was like, the microphone's a little too hot or something's clipping.
Yeah.
But they go, that's the take.
Yeah. Because the songs were great and it didn't matter. And the performances were great, which is another thing we're going to talk about as we go along about the importance of performance. But those songs, it doesn't matter that the recordings have some issues. You know, the songs are so good that no one cares. And people still listen to all those songs and love them. So there is something super duper important about the song and about working that out. And you want to work it out before you go in the studio, because the worst time to be changing your arrangement or whatever is in the studio when you're trying to record.
Yeah.
And the clock is ticking.
You know, I think sometimes it's okay to experiment a little bit, but you should have the foundation ready to go. I think that would, but you know, not if somebody says in the back of the room, like they have a clarity moment and I know it needs to go here. Try it, you know?
Yeah. This isn't to say that you can't have some spontaneous moments in the studio, but, and you know, I think in general though, you should work out certain things with your song. Obviously, the structure of the song, you know, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, or is it something else? You should work out the tempo. And you may find when you actually are there in the studio, man, it feels like it's sluggish or whatever, and you can try it faster or vice versa. But those are things that you could do before you get in the studio, and you could actually do a demo, which would be a good idea, because nowadays we have a lot of technology available to us that before, like that 4-track that I was able to get my hands on, like that wasn't just like, you know, around. Like I was lucky that my friend's dad had one, like, but now like you literally maybe have GarageBand on your phone even.
Yeah, totally.
So you can do a demo.
Yeah, lyrics too. Lyrics.
Yeah, figuring out your lyrics, you know, writing those out and going over them, refining them as much as possible.
Key of the song.
Key of the song is huge. Yeah, make sure that the singer can sing in that key, for instance.
It's not too high.
Yeah, not too high, that the notes are not, you know, unreachable. We do have auto-tune now and all that stuff, but ideally your singer should be able to hit the notes, and it should be a key they're comfortable singing in. And sometimes certain instruments, like, they can be difficult to play certain keys on. I'm not an expert on that, but I know that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, like string, like violins or horns, like sometimes there's certain keys that are like really hard to play in or something.
Yeah.
So if you have those instruments, or if you're thinking about bringing in someone to play those things, you might want to think about that kind of stuff. But yeah, we're not going to go into too much detail about each section here, but that's kind of the first step. And you might be working with a producer at this stage. You know, you may not be, but if you are working with a producer, then she can be, you know, very involved in this stage of songwriting and figuring out all those things, tempo and key, and thinking about even the feel of the song and that kind of thing. And now, a word from our sponsor,
Rarefied Recording.
Oh, that's me. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my studio, Rarefied Recording, and the services I offer there. The studio itself was built from the ground up, from the masterful plans of Mr. Wes Lachaux, so it sounds fantastic both in the control room and the live room. A 32-channel Neve Genesis console holds center court and is complemented by a wide array of outboard gear, instruments, and microphones. Your music will be in good company. If you live in the San Diego area, just head on over to rarefiedrecording.com to learn more and book a tour. You can also hear examples of my tracking and mixing work. If you aren't lucky enough to live in San Diego, let me be the first to suggest the idea of a destination recording experience. San Diego is BBB approved. The Better Business Bureau? No, beaches, burritos, and beer. Even if you're not a beach person, who's to complain with temperatures that are very often in the 70s? Even the winter months are averaging in the mid-60s. And being relatively dry, rain is unlikely to get in your way. The studio is very centrally located, and you can get to just about anywhere in the area in 15 to 20 minutes. Even Mexico. And while burritos are technically not a food you find in Mexico itself, San Diego has taken the concept to blissful culinary heights. You can't go hardly 100 yards here without running into a little taco shop that will be 10 times better than whatever options you have in your town. If Mexican isn't your thing, no worries. There are tons of great restaurants in the area, including a barbecue place 3 blocks away that rivals anything I've tried in Texas. And adjacent to it is one of over 150 craft breweries in San Diego. If you love beer, we gotcha. The West Coast IPA style is a specialty here, but we've got brewers doing all kinds of beers, and several have tasting rooms in walking distance. Did I mention that accommodations are available? So head on over to rarefiedrecording.com and reach out for a quote today. That's RAREFIED recording.com. And now back to the episode. But yeah. That's the first step, and then the next step would be what we call tracking or recording, which is when you actually go in the studio and get the kind of the raw material, recording all the different tracks, all different instruments. There's many ways to do that. You can do it all together. You can do it piecemeal, one thing at a time, or you can do a combination, like some stuff together and some stuff that's what's called overdubbed. We're going to assume that you don't know a lot of things. This may be like, oh yeah, I know what overdub is, but yeah. But for those who don't, it's when you've recorded one thing and then you kind of layer on top of it. You're listening to it, listening to what you've already done, and then adding another track to it. That's an overdub.
What about the part of being prepared for the studio?
Well,
Making
yeah,
sure.
That is definitely something we're going to be going into a lot more. Yeah. I'm just trying to give people the 50,000 foot view of the process on this one. Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, so there's certainly a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to be talking about as far as making sure instruments are ready for the studio and making sure you're practiced and all that kind of stuff before you get to the studio itself. But yeah, in the big picture, this whole recording stage it's more about capturing these performances, right? And performance is so key. We kind of touched on it for a second ago, but I mean, wouldn't you say, Brian? The song is number 1 and performance is like number 2? Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think another thing is depending on your experience with being in a studio, if you rehearse a lot and be prepared, you're going to be around people where you have to perform and sing. So it might be a little scary, you might be intimidated, but it's a great stage of the process, and when you hear yourself come back through the speakers the first time in a studio, it could be you might hear some things you can improve on, which is a good thing.
Yes, but I know what you're saying. I call it red light syndrome.
Yeah, right.
So if there's a recording light that says recording and it's red, which I do have in my studio, but I kind of hid it away somewhere so you don't have to stare at it. It's more for people who are walking through the doors. They know that you might be interrupting something. But yeah, the red light syndrome, where everything was cool until you knew that you were actually recording, and then suddenly you just and
you have these strangers looking at you.
Yes, and people are looking at you, the engineer's looking at you, your bandmates there's a lot on the line, in a sense. Like this is going to be the definitive version of the song, and that one that everyone's going to listen to over and over, yourself included. And so there's a lot of desire to get it right, and so it's natural to be nervous, especially if it's your first time. Probably some artists never totally get over that.
It's like stage fright in a sense, it's part of the game.
Yeah, but that's something that we'll kind of talk about more, I think, as we get into those sections. Some things you could do to work through that.
I liked what you said in your book about that. It's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some techniques that you could use or just things to know, for instance, like, yes, you're making a record, but this is not brain surgery, for instance,
Right.
where no one's life is on the line. You can make a mistake and it's okay. Just do
Keep
it again.
going. Yeah.
You just keep going and come back to it. There's many ways to fix the mistakes in the studio. You can do what's called a punch in, which is where you kind of are listening to what you just did, and then you get to that moment where you made a mistake, and the engineer is able to kind of just start recording right then, and you just roll over and fix that mistake. And there's a lot of ways to do it, or you can just do multiple takes from the top of the song, and then the engineer can actually what's called comping the whatever it is, the vocal or the performance, and just use the moments that are the best, which is a great way to do it also. So yeah, we'll get more and more into all this stuff.
It's funny, people put a little bit too much pressure on themselves sometimes. They think they have to do it in 2 or 3 takes, or they think that the take has to be a full take in order to use it. But all the pros I've ever worked with, comping a vocal is common.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll comp it to several days in a row until they really nail it. It's just part of it.
Yeah, I think there's a myth that the best performers rather, like, are so good that it's just one take and it's done. And there's a few that I've heard of that were like that.
Frank.
But, yeah, probably Frank Sinatra. Yeah.
With the live orchestra.
Yeah, so there's a few that could do that, but I think a lot of them, it's a lot of takes and a lot of comping.
Definitely.
And so it wasn't just one perfect performance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So you don't have to feel bad that you're not attaining that, because except for a few exceptions, it's mostly a comping situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, so recording, and also is, you got to remember, you're capturing all this raw material, and the next step is mixing. So you're going to hear things start to come together in the recording process, and a lot of engineers are trying to make it start to sound like a record at the beginning. At least that's I think a lot of the better engineers are able to do that, where they're capturing sounds that are with the final product in mind, and so, but at the same time, you're going to maybe do some rough mixes in the recording stage. But what you're going to be hearing is still unpolished, per se. And that's fine. That's just, the important part of tracking is to gather this kind of raw material, and not that it's all perfect just yet. But
and the rough mixes to just sort of like assess what you have.
Yes.
To make sure you're happy with it. And if you need to improve something, because sometimes you'll hear things outside the studio you don't hear in the studio.
Yes.
For me, anyway, I know that it's true.
Yeah. Well, especially with, taking a day later or whatever, and you've had some time to process. But I mean, that's a big part of the point of rough mixes, I guess, is it's something that you can digest later and decide whether you have everything you need. Before you eventually move on to the mixing stage, because ideally you once you're in mixing, you're not going back and then recording some new stuff. It can happen, but you want to make sure you have everything that you wanted, all the different instruments, because you might decide like, oh, it'd be great if there was piano at this part, and you didn't really think of that while you were writing the song, but now that you're hearing it, wow, piano would be great there. So, you could do that before you get to the mixing stage, ideally. And that does happen. Like, in my experience, like, you have a song and you start recording it, and then you start to hear things that you didn't really think of before, because for some reason hearing it back as a recording is different than just playing it. And I think that's why doing demos can help, because that you get that experience kind of even before you're in the studio, and then you might be more prepared with what you want to record.
You can kind of hear if everything's working together. And
yes. We'll be talking more in detail, I think, in the next episode, probably about arrangement, and which is part of that step 0, that before you even step in the studio, the songwriting, starting to think about how things work together, because it's very easy for people to kind of create parts that step on each other and make it so you can't really appreciate each of them.
Totally.
Arrangement is kind of a huge thing that people don't think about as much as they probably should.
Yeah.
So yes, recording, all this raw material is captured, rough mixes are generated, and then you move on to the next step, which is mixing. And mixing is where you take this, what we usually call multi-track recording, because there'll be in whatever program nowadays, it's usually a program, but it could be a tape recording still potentially. You have all these different tracks. It could be, even parts of a drum kit could be, different tracks, kick drum, snare drum, etc. Then you could have, multiple guitar tracks and bass track and vocal tracks and background vocals and piano and whatever is on your song. They're all different tracks and they need to be combined. They need to be mixed. So that's a process of, the balance, which is just the volume of each of those tracks and how they relate to each other, and how they change maybe over time, and the panning, which is, since most of what we listen to still is stereo, that's the two speakers, the left and the right, and where you put something in the mix, whether it's hard left, hard right, it's in the center or somewhere in between, maybe it moves, who knows. And Brian, you've actually mixed probably some stuff in surround.
Yeah. Some
television stuff.
And Atmos now is becoming a big deal.
Yeah. So that's starting to become a thing, which maybe you'll be interested in doing. I haven't done it myself at all, so I have no idea.
Yeah. I'm in the process of getting that going.
The Atmos?
Yeah.
Wow. So you're going to put some speakers on your ceiling?
Not sure yet how I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Several ways. It's still pretty new, and I know a lot of guys are doing it. And my friend that I was talking to over the weekend, he's starting to do it, and so it's in the works.
Yeah. So yeah, but we're probably mostly gonna focus on stereo in our discussions, just because that's still the most common type of release that people are doing, at least for music.
Yeah.
Obviously film is usually done in some sort of surround format, but so yeah, mixing is, is the levels, the panning, equalization could be part of it, basically changing, what frequencies are maybe accentuated or de-accentuated in a particular track. Effects, reverb, delay.
Yeah.
What else do you use?
Oh gosh, it's funny. I was just thinking of the team players in the band or whatever it is, and if you've selected an engineer that you feel good with, and just everybody has their job, and you got to give them their space to do that. Like the guitar player, and you don't want to be standing over your shoulder saying, "No, play it like here." You let him work it out. Same thing with the mixer.
Yeah,
you let him work it out and see where he takes it. And
when we get into mixing more, we're gonna talk about like attended versus unattended mixing, because I do all my work unattended because I want to be able to have that time to just sort of work it out. And then let the artist then hear that, make comments, we do revision. But that is part of the process, is the revision process, right? Is you're going to get this mix from your mixer and you're going to have a chance to weigh in. Whether if you were there for part of the mixing, then you will have done that, I suppose, in real time. But even then, there'll be some time to digest what the mix is and listen to it on different systems, and that's definitely part of something we're going to talk about, how to listen and how to give revision notes. But you're going to have this chance to kind of do a revision or 2 or 3, or it depends on the mixer and how many they allow and what the costs are. It varies, but that is part of the process of mixing. So there'll be a chance for you to weigh in and make sure it's what you want. Because at the end of the day, like, this is your music, and you should be in control of what it sounds like. So you should keep working through that process with whoever you're working with to get it to that point. And if someone is kind of stepping on it and saying, no, you don't know what you're doing and I know better, like, maybe they're not the right person for you then. It's
important having the right people that you feel comfortable with, and sort of maybe not be like-minded, but sort of for the project or the song, maybe in the same area,
Yeah, there has to be a kind of a mutual respect.
Yeah.
For each other, and yeah, we're definitely going to talk more about how to select an engineer, how to select a mixing engineer, and then the next step, which is mastering. So once you're finalized your mix and you're very happy with it, there's one more step in the process, which you could skip, but we generally don't. It's called mastering. It's kind of changed over the years of what that means. But basically, another engineer, and perhaps the mix engineer as well. These days, that's more and more common. The mixer will also master the record, but it's kind of like a sweetening process. I say usually, like they work with just the stereo mix. If we're ignoring surround sound for now, they take the stereo mix, and he or she listens to it kind of with a fresh perspective, and perhaps make some broad adjustments to the equalization of the track. Maybe it needs a little more low, a little more highs, or maybe there's certain frequencies that are just, there's too much of them in there. They need to bring them down. There's a whole range of things like that they may need to just kind of subtly adjust. Or maybe drastically adjust if the mixer didn't know what they were doing or had an issue with their room. And
yeah, you hope it's kind of close.
Yeah. What I always tell people is the better the mix, the less you'll hear a change in the master. Mm-hmm. Because a really good mix might not really need anything in the mastering stage.
That's true.
Yeah. But the other thing the mastering generally does is it will make your recording a little louder most of the time. Just because the mixer's not really focused on like the overall loudness of the record per se. Mm-hmm. They're just kind of doing their thing, and then there is sometimes a need to get it up to a certain level that's similar to a lot of other recordings that are being released at this time, which has changed over the years. And there's this whole thing called the loudness wars that happened where people just kept trying to push the records louder and louder.
There's also, there's different formats that you may need for certain releases.
True.
If you go into iTunes, sometimes they may need mastered for iTunes, which is something mastering guys can do.
Yeah.
Or they'll probably send anything that's going to be streamed a lower level.
Yeah, streaming has they normalize everything to a certain level. So if your recording is really, really loud, they're actually going to lower the level. Some of them may raise the level of a recording that's low, but sometimes they just don't touch it at all in that case. Mm-hmm. But they do definitely, I think most of them pull down the level of something that's really loud. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a sweet spot where one could master your record to for streaming where it wouldn't be touched at all. But I've heard different mastering engineers talk about this in different ways of basically like, I don't care to make it a certain loudness but basically adjusting the loudness is usually part of the mastering process. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to vinyl, like you may actually need a separate master for the vinyl, because vinyl is like a physical medium with a kind of certain restrictions to it. Like you can't put too much low end on vinyl, for instance, because the needle will literally like jump out of the groove.
So much for your sub.
Yeah. And you can't put too much high end on it either, because that can cause the needle to break not your needle at home, but the needle that's cutting the record can actually be destroyed if it's trying to put too much high end onto the record.
Crazy.
Yeah. So there's certain limitations to vinyl. So if you're going to vinyl, you're probably going to need like a separate master for that, and want to work with someone who's experienced with mastering for vinyl. But there's just kind of this process usually of EQ and loudness, which is using tools like compressors and limiters. And then, maybe some other secret sauce that the mastering engineer has to enhance the record a little bit further. Some harmonic distortion or something, running it through certain pieces of gear or certain plugins or whatever it is to give that final presentation to your song. Mm-hmm. Anything else you can say generally about mastering at this point?
No, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so that's kind of the whole process, except for, of course, releasing your song, which is not going to be part of this podcast.
Right.
We don't know much about that. At least I don't. And the book stops there too.
Usually pick your service.
Yeah, there's all these
CD Baby or
exactly
DistroKid or
yeah, that's how it goes these days. Usually, is there's some sort of service that kind of puts your music everywhere. All these different streaming services and what have you. But yeah, that's a whole other thing. After you're done with all the recording steps. But yeah, that's basically all we wanted to talk about, I think, in this first episode is this big picture overview of recording process, introducing ourselves and what this podcast is all about.
Cool.
And I hope you guys enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to this podcast, and we'll be coming out with more and more episodes as time goes on, and go through in more detail each of those steps and how you're going to prepare yourself for them and what you're going to be looking to do, how to build your team, and
it's important.
A lot of tips that are going to help you avoid some pitfalls, and not waste your time. And I think it's going to be potentially really useful for a lot of people who are new to the studio, or like I said, maybe you've done a little bit of studio work, but you still want to learn more so you can be more efficient in the studio and be better prepared.
I think it'll totally help you focus on the important parts and not get caught up in rabbit holes.
Yeah, there's certain areas that you could go down that don't matter, and whereas the most important things, like we've already mentioned, like the song and the performance, like you got to remember those things. You got to make sure you give yourself space to give a good performance, for instance, when you're in there for the tracking sessions. So you don't want to be frazzled, and you don't want to be like, oh man, we wasted all this time and now we only have 30 minutes, and no one wants to be in that situation, but it does happen where you're pushed to that point because you had all these issues with your guitar amp, and there's all these things that you could work out before you step in the studio, and make everything super smooth.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe something we'll talk about later, but and not to rely on the studio personnel to make everything work. If you don't have a dialed in guitar sound, that's not his job. You should if you're looking for certain sounds, try to find it yourself.
Yeah, it starts at the source. That's something we will talk about for sure. Is the best place to get things right is at the instrument or the amplifier itself, versus being like trying to tell the engineer, can you turn this crappy sound into this other sound,
Can you get a sound on my guitar? Yeah.
So there's a lot you can do on your own to, really make it how you want it, which is ideally, that's what you're looking for. Is you have probably something in your head of what you're envisioning, and you want the final product to be close to that, or exactly that, or maybe even better than that. And if you work with the right people, they can help you get there and make it better. But it does start with you, and having that vision, or working with a producer who helps you with that vision.
In your pre-production.
In the pre-production stage, that's a big part of what can be done, is kind of putting together this vision.
Yeah, so you're not trying to get a sound for an hour in the studio that you could have set up and had ready to go.
Yeah. Totally. So that's it for episode 1 of Prepping for the Studio. Thank you for listening. We'll be back.
Awesome. Thanks.
See ya. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for listening to Prepping for the Studio. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends. Episode info and my ebook, A Musician's Guide to the Recording Studio, are available at preppingforthestudio.com. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out there. Prepping for the Studio was recorded and edited at Rarefied Recording by me, Roy Silverstein. Theme music written by myself and Ariel Levine. Performed and recorded by Ariel Levine. Many thanks to my co-host Brian Scheuble and you. Best of luck to you and your musical endeavors. And remember, as Alexander Graham Bell once said, before anything else, preparation is the key to success. We'll see you next time.